In our discussion of Hebrew parallelism, we've looked at two main approaches. The first one was by Robert Lowth, the 18th century bishop. And what we saw with Lowth was that his categories were fairly rigid and somewhat simplistic. So we looked at synonymous parallelism, antithetic, synthetic, staircase, and numerical, with these last being kind of smaller categories. We then turned to James Kugel, who really attacked Lowth and probably went a little too far with that, and he simplified things radically. At that point, we had A and what's more, B. If we have two lines in a row, or even three, then the first concept, A, is somehow echoed by B. It's changed, it's altered, there are differences, but this relationship between A and B is incredibly complex. We cannot just put kind of one stamp on it and say that's what it is. We have to treat almost every verse in the Bible, every poetic verse at least, as somewhat unique in its parallelism. And of course, Kugel also had more to say. He was somewhat skeptical that there is such a thing as clear poetry as opposed to prose, because his argument was that A and B, this way of thinking, is much broader than poetry. So we've seen then that Robert Lowth and James Kugel gave us very different approaches. And if you've done the activity of analyzing an entire psalm, you will probably have found yourself kind of moving back and forth between these two models. Sometimes you can find very clear examples of, let's say, synonymous or antithetic parallelism, and other times you find things that don't quite fit. In that case, it's a bit like trying to examine vehicles and make sense of the different types, and all you have is very basic categories, like, a truck, a car, or a van. But what if you come across something that's in between, that looks a little bit different, and you're not quite sure what to do with it? So the main takeaway then is that we have to keep an open mind. We have to treat each verse kind of by itself, while we can still make use of the categories that Lowth gave us. And if we have this open mind, then we'll be prepared not to always expect neat patterns, but we can still analyze and make sense of poetic passages. I want to provide one more concept here, one more way of thinking about this that will allow us to wrap up this chapter. And the term I'm going to introduce to you is dynamic movement. Okay, so dynamic movement. Dynamic movement. This is a phrase or term that was given to us by Robert Alter. So Robert Alter is another scholar who's had a lot to say about Hebrew parallelism. You can read his books if you like. He's a little easier to follow than somebody like Kugel, much more accessible, but doesn't give us quite as much of the historical perspective, I think. So Alter is very good, and one of the things he focuses on is how the lines relate to one another. How do we get from one line to the next, right? How do we create a kind of movement? Now, I've picked this particular example, Psalm 100, verse 3, because it very nicely shows a sense of movement, and two other terms that Robert Alter uses that apply very well here are the terms intensification and focusing. So intensification, and focusing. All right. It's like we zoom in and we intensify the thought and we really dwell on it. So Psalm 100 verse 3 is a great example of this. We read here, "Know that the Lord is God. It is He who made us and we are His. We are His people, the sheep of His pasture." Now, if you compare the beginning of this, "Know that the Lord is God," to the very end, "the sheep of His pasture," and you just look at those two things, it sounds like entirely different concepts, right? We've moved a long ways from the beginning to the end. So it seems like we could call this synthetic parallelism if we just started with Lowth's categories. It seems somewhat synthetic. And if we wanted to be more specific, we could also recognize features of staircase parallelism, right? And we are His, and we are His people. There's that repetition there. So let's say that this is staircase or climactic parallelism, another word for the same thing. This really seems then about movement. One thing leads to another, and there's a real development. But if we look more closely, we can see that a couple of concepts are really explored in the entire verse. And these two concepts are creation on the one hand, so creation, and God's care for his creation. Okay, so if we look at the first line, know that the Lord is God, right? God is supreme, and then it says he made us, so there's the sense of creation, which is usually a reflection of his glory and his greatness. And then it says we are his people, and then finally the sheep of his pasture. So the pasture, that has the sense of care. And what we're doing here is we're moving from creation to care, right? These things ultimately are connected. If God created the world, then he wants to care for it. And if he made us, then we belong to him and he's going to look after us. So there is one single concept in all of this, one single idea that's being explored, even though there's this movement. Now, if we come back to Robert Alter's categories then, or his terminology, we can say, okay, we have this single concept, this single idea, but it's expressed through a kind of dynamic movement. It's developed, it's intensified, we focus, we zoom in a sense. Okay, there's a zooming in. The last line is much more specific than the first. And it's a very complex process, isn't it? So what we should do then is when we read these examples of Hebrew parallelism, we should slow down, we should meditate on the lines and see how they intensify, how they focus, how they zoom in, and as a result, we'll have a much better sense of what the poet is trying to do. Now, Alter sometimes goes a bit too far by focusing too much on intensification, because that suggests that the second line tends to be more specific than the first. And this happens often, but it doesn't happen always, right? So we have to be a little bit careful with that. But on the whole, Alter's really good at providing examples of this dynamic movement. So when we listen to a verse of biblical poetry, then, it's a little bit like going to a cathedral and listening to a choir with sounds bouncing off the walls, right? A very complex sound. And particularly in the more complex verses in the Bible, that's also the effect that's created. We have to slow down, we have to meditate on it, and we have to see the beauty and intricacy of the lines. Now, we shouldn't exaggerate that because there are simple verses as well. Sometimes we have very straightforward echoing. There's not much to reflect on. But I think if we have the right mindset, then we can appreciate the beauty and the subtle nuances of biblical poetry.